So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar. I am Rachel Beasley, the Strategic Dairy Farm Knowledge Exchange Manager for Wales, and today I'm going to be joined by AHDB's Head of Dairy Development, Nick Parsons, Vet Karen Bond, and one of AHDB's strategic dairy farmers, Arthur Owen. So the webinar today is going to involve an update from Nick Parsons, an introduction to Arthur Owen's farm, Bodysgaw, for those of you that haven't been there, an overview on Johne's disease pathology, so defining your herd status, Johne's results, looking at the risks entering and already on your farm, and also looking at Arthur's on-farm management techniques to combat Johne's. Throughout the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions at any time. There's a little questions box at the side of your screen. All of these questions are completely anonymous, and we will answer as many as we can during the presentation, after the videos, and also we'll keep some to the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nick Parsons, who is our Head of Dairy Development at AHDB and joined a year ago to progress the Strategic Dairy Farms Initiative as part of the wider Farm Excellence Programme.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody, and yeah, welcome to one of the Strategic Dairy Farm meetings. Rachel, do you want to flick on the slide? Thank you. We've had a strong beginning to our digital presence as Strategic Dairy Farms. It's not what we had planned with regards to the meetings on farm that we'd set the Strategic Dairy Farm Programme up to deliver, but it's becoming, with the two launches we've had so far, a really strong way of widening out our geographic area and letting more people be available to hear what's happening on the strategic farms. So the recordings of the two launches we have, and this one that we're having today, will be on our YouTube, AHDB YouTube channel. So either go through to the website or look it up on YouTube. It's important, I think, we consider why we set up the Strategic Dairy Farm Programme, and those the idea behind it was very much around encouraging farmers to exchange ideas on farm and now through a digital presence, and measuring KPIs, setting targets for themselves, and looking to benchmark against each other. So we have 15 SDFs, strategic dairy farms across Britain now, and that network is continuing to grow. We have launches in July and further farmers coming on board. It's two-way engagement, and I think I would encourage you today, even though we can't do face-to-face for the obvious reasons of COVID, what I would encourage you all to do is pose those questions to Rachel, through to Arthur and Karen, and get the most out of it, but also feedback to Arthur what your views are with regards to what he's doing, what he may be able to do in a different way that your experience can help Arthur. And that's all part of what we're trying to do. Visit the website. The farm excellence pages are all there for the 15 strategic dairy farms, along with the arable farms and beef and lamb, and right across the AHDB sectors we have farm excellence pages there, so visit the website for that. And this is very much as well as with a digital presence, and not instead of the meetings that we will have. Looking forward, we hope to be able to get back to farm meetings, but we believe that this is going to be a way for the future of ensuring that from a geographic base, people can visit the farm on the website, but also hear what's going on and keep up to date. So I'll hand back to Rachel, and good luck through the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for that brief update. Yeah, as Nick said, this is very much a two-way engagement. So as many questions and challenges to Arthur as possible throughout the webinar would be fantastic. And I will continue to feed those through to Karen and Arthur. So we're going to show you a quick video now of to introduce you to Arthur and also to his farm, Bodysgaw. He's one of our strategic dairy farmers in Wales. So here we go.
Bodysgaw is a tenanted farm. It's been in the family since 1939. I'm the third generation, you know. We're a dairy farm and autumn block calving herd. And I've done that because just to keep a simple system, really. The old calving 10 weeks, beginning on 4th of September. And we hope to be finished by the 10th or 12th of November. There'll be 400 calving in that block. There's 300 calving in September, and then the other 100 will be calving the next 6 weeks after that. Mine are mostly Friesian or Friesian cross. They should be yielding up to about 7,000 litres naturally now, because the genetics is there for them to yield that. It's always room to improve every farm. There's more. I can improve my litres from forage. If I do that, it's a better margin and works out to more profit, hopefully. It doesn't matter which farm you go to, there's things to pick up, and I hope to pick things up from other farmers as well.
There we go. That's just a brief introduction to Bodysgaw. So I'm going to hand over to Karen Bond now, our technical expert for the day. So Karen graduated from Glasgow Vet School in 2000, and she's held many roles in the dairy industry, including working in vet practice, research, teaching and knowledge exchange, and now currently works as the Veterinary Advisor for the National Milk Records. Karen's also a member of the advisory group to the National Yoni's Management Plan and is the author to the BCVA online Yoni's veterinary training. So over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, welcome everybody. Really great to have so many people joining us on this webinar. The idea today is that I'm going to take you through some background of Johne's disease. So I'm going to talk very much about the biology of the disease, because I'm a firm believer that if you can understand how the disease works, then it makes much more sense when we start to talk about why we do the testing we do, and also why we ask you to do the management changes that we do as well. If you can understand how that relates to trying to block transmission of the disease, then I think it all makes much more sense. So we're going to very much start with the basics of the disease, and then as we go through, we're going to see some videos from Arthur which are going to highlight some of the areas that he's looked at, be that about testing or his management as well, and we'll weave that through into thinking about how his management is changing over time and how that relates to how he's tackling Johne's disease. Okay, so thinking about the disease itself. So it is a bacterial disease, and it's a bacterial disease of the intestine, and it's caused by an organism called Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis. And the reason that I tell you that is that it's an organism that belongs to the same family as the one that causes TB, and it shares quite a lot of the same characteristics. So it's a very slow growing disease, and it's also a disease for which there is no treatment and no cure. So very much the same again as we look at with TB. But there are also some noticeable differences. And with MAP, it causes Johne's, which is a disease of the intestine. So what happens is it causes thickening of the intestine, and that stops the cow from being able to absorb the water out of her food and also the nutrients out of it. And that's what gives us those classic clinical signs. If any of you have ever seen a cow with clinical Johne's, they waste away because they can't absorb any goodness out of their food, so they lose the protein, they lose the energy, and also they have that really horrible scour. And again, that's because they're not getting any goodness out of the food, but also they're not able to absorb the water out of it. So it is a disease of the intestine, and that's where we see those classic clinical signs. With clinical disease in Johne's, it tends to be in adult animals that we see it. So you'll often hear us talking about it being 3, 4, 5+ years old animals. But what we know is that actually it is a disease that's most commonly caught as a baby calf. So that gives us this very long incubation period that's again quite classic of these bacterial diseases. So between the time of actually being infected to the time of having that clinical disease can be a period of anything up to 5, 6, even 7 years. So that clinical disease is something that we used to see quite commonly. We see it much less commonly now on farm, but once the cow gets to that stage, there really is very little you can do for her, and the chances are she will leave your farm as a dead loss. So one of the important things to think about is what happens in between that animal becoming infected and seeing that clinical disease. So what I'm going to do is share with you a graph and just try to map out what happens with Johne's disease during that time period. So if you look at the graph that's in front of you on the screen now, you'll see that on the axis we've got antibody level there. Now, when we think about testing for any disease, you'll be familiar with the fact that there are two ways to test for disease. So you can actually look for the organism itself. So if you think about something like BVD, you might use tag and test to actually try to find the virus in your calves. Or you can test for antibodies. And antibodies are the animal's reaction to disease. So with Johne's, it's the same. We can look for the MAP organism itself, and that's usually done in fecal samples. Or we can look for the animal's reaction to disease, and that's antibody testing. And antibody testing tends to be the mainstay of Johne's disease management because it's easy to do and it's a significantly cheaper test as well. So we can repeat it more frequently for the same amount of money, which gives us more information. So you'll see antibody level on the side there. You'll see I've put a line across, which is our cutoff. So for every test, you have a cutoff where we say above that level, the animal is positive. Below that level, the animal is negative. So that's where we are with that line going across there. Across the bottom axis, you'll see age of cow in years, and that's just going from birth all the way through that cow's life in years. Okay, so that's the basis of the graph. So what we're going to look at now is what happens with this animal when it encounters Johne's disease. So things to remember with Johne's disease, it does tend to be a disease that the animal catches at a very young age. And in our dairy situation, it's very often within the first 24 to 48 hours of life. And there's a couple of really good reasons for that. So if you think about your calf when it's first born, it's born with no innate immunity. It's reliant on the antibodies it gets from the colostrum it gets. So whether that's you harvesting colostrum and feeding that calf, or whether it's that calf suckling, it's relying on those antibodies that it gets from its mother to actually help it fight disease because it has an incomplete immune system at birth. So to allow those antibodies to cross from the colostrum in the gut into the blood, it has a very open, porous gut lining. And unfortunately, as well as allowing antibodies to cross, it also allows other things, so pathogens, bacteria and viruses. So it's a perfect time that calf is wholly susceptible to Johne's disease at birth when it's got that open gut. And the second reason why this is the most critical stage where these animals get infected is that that is when they are exposed to adult cow muck. Now remember, this is a disease of the intestine, causes thickening, granulomas in the intestine and that scour, and it's that muck that's where all of the MAP bacteria come from. So infected cow muck is the biggest risk of transmission. And while those calves are in your maternity area exposed to adult cow muck, then that's the biggest period of risk. So you've kind of got a bit of double whammy around the time of birth for our dairy calves. You've got exposure to adult cow muck and that porous open gut to allow bacteria to cross. So imagine on this graph, your calf has just been born, it gets a mouthful of the MAP bacteria because again, that's the most common transmission route. It needs to actually ingest that MAP bacteria and becomes infected with Johne's disease. So ingests the MAP bacteria and now it's infected. So where does that bacteria then go? And this is where you have to have a grudging respect for the Johne's disease bacteria because it's very clever. It's evolved like this over thousands of years to actually be very effective at what it does. And it actually goes and lives inside white blood cells in the calf. And you might think, hang on a minute, white blood cells, aren't they what are supposed to actually help fight infection? And yes, absolutely they are. And that's the beauty of this bug. It goes and it hides inside the white blood cells and it actually sends out signals saying, it's okay, not here, nothing to see, ignore me. So the immune system doesn't react. As far as the cow is concerned, there is nothing wrong. So at this stage, this animal is infected with Johne's disease, but its immune system is completely unaware of it. So that cow is not producing any antibodies at that stage. So you may have heard from your vet, don't bother testing young animals for Johne's disease because you won't find anything. And this is the reason. So our recommendation usually is any animals under 2 years of age, we don't bother testing. Doesn't mean that they're not infected, but they're highly unlikely to be positive on our testing at that stage. So that's stage 1. At some point in that animal's life, so remember this animal is Johne's infected, at some point in that animal's life, they will start to lose control of the disease. And we believe that that's triggered by stress. So often what we see is it could be that heifer that calves in for the first time, it could be a cow that gets another disease, so mastitis, lameness, a DA, something like that. And what happens is that stress causes a dip in the animal's immunity. And as that dip in immunity occurs, that allows the MAP bacteria to come back out of the white blood cells and reproduce. And when it comes out and reproduces, it's available to be shed. So at that stage, that animal becomes infectious. So is shedding the bacteria and could transmit the disease to other animals. But also, once it's back outside of the white blood cells, it's visible to that cow's immune system. So she starts to produce antibodies. So what you can see here in stage 2 is that we get that peak of antibody production. Now, provided that cow is in otherwise good health, gets over whatever the stressor was, so okay, she had a bit of a rough calving, but now she's over that, you've treated her case of mastitis and she's now back to health, then her immunity peaks again and she actually is able to control the disease and the MAP bacteria go back inside the white blood cells to hide again. And once they're back inside the white blood cells, there is nothing to keep triggering that immune response. So it's not keeping triggering antibody production, and you see those antibody levels go back down. And this is something that is repeated over this stage of the disease. Now, stage 2 is what we call subclinical disease. So at that point, you're highly unlikely to see those classic clinical signs of scouring and weight loss because you're not getting large peaks and it's not sustained. But what you often see during that stage 2 is this subclinical disease, and it's a production effect. So during this time, the best way of thinking about it is it's a bit of an ongoing battle between the bug and the cow. Some points the bug's winning, it gets to come out, it gets to reproduce. Sometimes the cow's winning. She gets on top of it and sends it back inside those white blood cells. So the cow is never going to get rid of the Johne's at that stage. She's always going to have it, but at some stages, she's able to keep a lid on it with her immune system. Now, what we do tend to see during this subclinical phase are other issues. Okay, so 2 pictures of cows there. Which one of those cows do you think has Johne's disease? Obvious answer would be the one on the left, but because it's me, it's obviously a trick question. And actually, both of these cows have repeatedly tested positive on milk for Johne's disease. So the one on the right there, you can see she's got a red tag in her ear, and she has been repeatedly positive on milk testing. But how can I, as a vet, convince a farmer that she's got Johne's and that she's a risk and that she needs to be culled when she looks like that? And this is just really to say that during that subclinical phase, these cows may look perfectly healthy. So that cow, this picture is courtesy of a colleague of mine, and she actually persuaded the farmer that she was going to take a fecal sample and actually look to see if there was any MAP bacteria there. And if she could demonstrate that this cow was shedding the bacteria and then was obviously a risk of transmitting it to other animals, that he would get rid of it. And when the muck sample came back, it was highly positive for MAP. So despite looking fat as butter and fit, she definitely did have Johne's and was a risk. And on further questioning, she was actually out in that field because all of a sudden her milk had dried up. And, you know, she dried herself off early. And this is quite a common thing that we see with these animals in this subclinical phase. So whilst they're not scouring, they're not losing weight, if you look at their production records, then quite often they are poor yielders, high cell count, persistently lame. You may have struggled to get them back in calf. So subclinical disease is quite a problem with Johne's. So going on from subclinical disease, so that cow, if you were to leave her, you know, we know that she's in stage 2, she's having these positives and testing. They then go on to this stage 3, and that's where instead of having an ongoing battle with the bug, they've lost the battle. The bug is out, it's reproducing, it's causing huge damage to the intestine. You see their antibody levels continue to raise, and that's the point at which you start to see clinical signs. Now, I'm going to keep coming back to this graph as I go through what I'm talking about, because it's quite relevant when we think about what we're trying to do with testing and also what we're trying to do with management. And you can hopefully start to see some of the problems. Now, I'm guessing that some of you who are listening today will already be doing some Johne's testing. Quite a lot of you may be using quarterly testing, and you might be quite familiar with seeing cows in that stage 2 of disease, where you might see a cow on this test be positive. She might even be positive on the next test, but on the one after that, all of a sudden she's negative again. And that's really confusing. And you think, well, the test must be wrong because, well, she can't be positive and then negative. She can't have Johne's and now she doesn't. And it's not that at all. It's actually just that that animal is in that stage 2 of disease where she has peaks and troughs of antibodies. She's in that ongoing battle, and sometimes she's producing antibodies and sometimes she's not. But what you've managed to do is to identify her as a Johne's risk early in that disease before she reaches stage 3 where she might go clinical. So if we think about the testing a little bit more, there's a few things to think about. You'll be familiar with the National Johne's Management Plan, hopefully, and also the new Red Tractor requirements. And one of the requirements of that is defining your herd status. So it's finding out whether you've got Johne's disease on your farm or not. And there are some minimum testing requirements to do that. So when we think about herd status, all you're trying to do with this testing is say, do I have Johne's in my herd, yes or no? And that's all you're doing. This is not about managing the disease. It is literally just about looking to see whether it's there or not. So what you want to do is try to maximize your chances of finding it if it's there. You'll see that bulk milk is on there and it's crossed out with a big red line. And there's a reason for that. Whilst you'll be familiar with bulk milk testing for other diseases, so BVD, for example, it's really not very sensitive at all with Johne's. And the reason for that is you can have cows infected with Johne's but not producing antibodies. So when you think about your herd dynamic, you've got all of those cows contributing to a bulk tank. If you only have a very small number of them producing antibodies at any one time, then actually you can get a bulk milk sample coming back negative, but you still have Johne's infection in your herd. So we don't recommend that as testing, and most laboratories don't offer it anymore. So what we do is we look at selecting cows that are most likely to be Johne's positive. And again, as I've just said, they're the ones that are going to be high cell count per yielders, maybe lame, the ones that have not got it back in calf. So that really is your cull list. So it's unsurprising that actually those animals end up on your cull list because of the production reasons that we've talked about. So a good way of looking to see whether you've got Johne's in your herd is actually to test those cows that are on your cull list and are about to leave. So a cull cow screen is a good way of doing it. The other way of doing it is a targeted 30 cow screen. So same premise, what you're doing is you're going to look at your cows and you're going to say, right, okay, I'm going to pick 30 who are poor yielding, high cell count, lame, fertility problems, maybe a little bit skinny, and I'm going to test them because they're the demographic that could very well have Johne's. And if I test all of those and none of them come back positive, then actually I'm probably low risk. So that's a herd status definition. But just by testing a selection of your cows, that isn't going to help you manage Johne's disease, but it is going to help you define your herd status. Okay, so now we're going to see a little video from Arthur that's just going to describe when and why he started with Johne's testing.
So following the testing, what's the process then of identifying the animals?
Once the results come back, we separate, we find the medium and the high cows, and we'll separate them and tag them with red tags.
To worry. In that video, Arthur was just explaining why and when he started to test. So Arthur started testing back back about a year and a half ago, and has now gone on to quarterly testing within the last year. Arthur, we have had a question for you from the audience. So Arthur, when you did start testing, were you looking to know your status, or was it for you to manage the cows within your herd?
Well, first of all, to find the status of the herd, because I had probably one or two every now and then. And also you find them earlier if you're testing for them. And also these days, the milk buyer is advising you to do that as well.
Yeah, were you surprised by having positive cows in your herd when you first started testing?
I was expecting about 5 or 6, but there was a lot more than that. A lot more.
Okay, Karen, we've also had a question for you as well, or we've had a couple. What determines that level 30 as being positive on your graph?
Okay, yeah, so every test has a cutoff, and that's optimized to give the test the best possible chance of finding animals that are infected, but also not giving us too many false positives. And so that cutoff is determined by the kit manufacturer who produces the kit. So 30 is what has been set as a threshold for over which we're confident that that animal is likely to be Johne's infected.
Okay, and I've just got one more as well. In terms of in that stage 2, where the cows are going up and down over that level, are the cows infectious when they're at those peaks?
Yeah, great question. So yes, what's triggering that antibody production is the bacteria coming back outside of the white blood cells and reproducing. And while it's multiplying, it is also then available to be shed in the muck. So yes, those peaks of antibodies follow on from peaks of shedding. So yes, absolutely, during that time, that cow will have periods of being infectious.
Thank you. That's great. And we'll carry on now, if that's all right, Karen.
Perfect, that's great. So just to come back to Arthur's answers there, it is often a bit of a shock for people when they do their first set of Johne's tests. You know, as Arthur said, he was seeing the odd clinical case, but was quite surprised by the number that tested positive. And that's because Johne's is what we call an iceberg disease. So the ones that you see with clinical signs are very much the tip of that iceberg. And if you think about them and go back to the graph I showed, they are the animals that are at the end of that disease. So they are at the end of stage 3. And you think about all of the other animals that you've got that are going to be in stage 2 and stage 1 within your herd. So very much an iceberg disease. For every clinical case you see, we think there are likely to probably be another 15 animals in the herd infected, so within a different stage of the disease. So yeah, interesting to hear that Arthur, despite having some clinical cases, was quite surprised by the number of positives he saw. Okay, so moving on, we've talked a little bit about testing for assessing herd status. So what we want to think about now is testing for control. So if we think about testing for control, what we usually talk about is something called strategic testing. And the reason we call it that is because what we're trying to do is to gather test results at a time we can use them to make management decisions. So if we come back to thinking about our Johne's disease, what are we trying to do? So everything we're trying to do with Johne's disease is about stopping that adult cow muck getting into the mouths of our calves. Okay, so remember that our calves are the most susceptible animals. I'm not saying that older animals can't become infected, but they are much less likely to become infected. So our targeting of our management is generally all around our calves, at least to start with. So what we need to do is to think about identifying animals that are a high risk of transmission. And if you think about it, the biggest time of risk of transmission is around calving. So it's having those adult cows that are shedding the MAP bacteria in muck and the potential for them to infect baby calves. So one point where we really want to know which animals are positive for Johne's is as they come up to calve, because what we really want to do is to reduce the possibility of them spreading it. So pre-calving is a really good time to assess your cows so that you can then look at making management decisions around the time of calving. And we'll talk about those management decisions a little later. The other time that it's really good to know is actually pre-breeding. Because again, if you think about your animals that are Johne's positive, we want to try and block transmission to the next generation. So we don't want to use those animals to breed replacements from. So again, we'd really like to know if that animal is Johne's positive before you use an expensive straw of sex semen to try and get a dairy heifer out of her. So that gives us 2 periods where we really would like to know that animal's status. So for a farm like Arthur's where they're block calving, then that's 2 periods during that we want to know. And for a block calver, that's relatively easy because all of the animals are in the same status. But again, take you back to that graph. You saw that stage 2 where you get peaks and troughs of antibodies. And if you think about if you just test those animals once a year, you may just catch that animal when she's at a trough of antibodies. She's not producing any antibodies, you get a negative result. That doesn't mean she doesn't have Johne's. So actually by increasing the number of tests you do, so again going from 1 pre-dry off to maybe 1 pre-dry off and 1 pre-breeding, or going towards quarterly testing, by repeating that testing you maximise your chances of catching that animal at a peak of antibodies. So that gives you much more of an opportunity to identify those positives earlier and try to manage them so they can't transmit the disease. And testing for control does involve testing all your adult animals because you need to know which are your high risk animals. It's not just a 30 cow screen where you test a few animals, you say, oh yeah, I've had 5 positives. Well, that doesn't help you control the disease. And the other thing that I've put on there, and it may seem a ridiculous statement to make, but a lot of people do forget, if you are using milk testing to test your adult cows and you have a bull, don't forget him. And don't ask the milk recorder to try and get a milk sample either. That doesn't work. So don't forget he needs to be part of your program as well and should be being blood tested along with you milk testing the cows. And what you use those strategic testing results for is to help you make decisions to manage the risk. So you can then effectively use breeding and culling decisions. But the other thing that I would say is you can test all you like, but unless you actually use those results, it's not going to help you. So when you're spending money testing, you absolutely want to make sure that you are using those results effectively. So let's have a quick look at some results. So again, you'll be familiar and possibly sick of the graph by now, but it's really important to think about. So remember, during stage 1 of disease, we could be testing those animals. They're going to repeatedly come back negative because there aren't any antibodies. Doesn't mean they don't have the disease. During stage 2, you're likely to get fluctuations. And if you look on the right-hand side there at those results, and you look at the 3rd animal down, 605, you'll see that she has had a 33, a 30. So they're 2 positive results, but her latest result is down at 1.5. So she's one of your classics that's in that stage 2. So she's had a peak of antibody where she had some shedding, probably something happened, another disease maybe, a period of stress. She's got over that now. She's got a lid back on the disease. But just because she's down at that 1.5 now doesn't mean that those 2 previous positive results were wrong. It just means that she's now in a period where she's on top of the disease and things for the moment are fine. But at some point something else will happen and that will go back up again. So she's quite a classic stage 2 cow. And don't be surprised if at the next test she goes back up to being positive again. It doesn't mean the testing's wrong, it just means it's a classic stage 2 cow. If you look at the 2 above, so the top line there, 388, now she is a classic progressor cow. So she is a cow that's going from stage 2 into stage 3. So she was positive at that 43, but now she's gone way up to 132. So she's on that red line going up in stage 3. She's one that's going to be on your cull list and really want to be going out of that herd before she becomes clinical. And 677 there, the one just down from her, she's had 2 results over 150. She is well into stage 3 of this disease. And again, she wants to be leaving your farm as soon as possible. The slightly worrying thing with those results is that both of those cows were not present at the last test. They were still alive, but they were not present. So it does make you wonder where they are. Are they dry and in the dry cow yard right now? You want to hope not. So just thinking about using those results, and it's really important that each time you get a set of results, you sit down, ideally with your vet, and have a plan of what you're going to do with all of those cows. So think about what you're going to do in terms of breeding decisions. So both of those two positive cows you really don't want to be breeding from again. They need to be leaving your herd straight away. 605 there, you may want to breed from her. You're not going to want to breed a replacement from her because you know she's got yonis, but it's possible you might want to breed her to a beef sire. You know, breed a beef animal out of her that's going to go for slaughter. You know, again, don't be breeding replacements from her. But these are the sort of decisions you can start to make once you start to get these results. Okay, so we're going to see another video now, and this is going to talk about how Arthur is now identifying his positive cows.
So following the testing, what's the process then of identifying the animals?
Once the results come back, we separate, we find the medium and the high cows, and we'll separate them and tag them with red tags.
Shows there how Arthur's identifying his positive cows. I just want to ask you, Arthur, did you consider any other form of identification for your Johne's positive animals?
I didn't really, because the vet recommended tagging with red tags, and it makes sense because it's easy to identify them after. You know, all the staff on the farm will know what the red tag would mean.
Fantastic. And Karen, again, we're very lucky. We've got some more questions for you here. Is there a test that you can use before your animals start milking, so before the cows reach calving?
Yeah, so as I said before in that graph, you do have that period of the disease where they're unlikely to be producing antibodies, and sort of received wisdom is that, you know, before the age of about 2, you're unlikely to see any antibody production. But we do know that on some farms we can see heifers calving in and being positive on their first or second test during that first lactation. And obviously then you've missed the boat because they've already calved in, and potentially they've calved in your clean area with all of your other cows. So on some farms we do look at testing heifers pre-first calving, and you can do that using a blood sample. So you still test them for antibodies exactly the same as you would be with the milk testing, but you're obviously just using a blood sample because they're pre-calving. And it's going to be on a farm by farm basis. For some farms it's quite important because they are seeing those cows becoming positive very early, but for other farms it just doesn't stack up on a cost benefit way because you're not identifying positive cows and you've obviously got the cost of blood sampling. So it's very much something to discuss with your vet. Look at your patterns of disease on farm and see whether it's something that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and I've just got another one here in terms of how other countries test for Johne's and what their thresholds are. Are they the same as we have here?
That's a really good question. I think I know why that's been triggered as well. So we obviously buy a lot of animals in from the continent, from various countries, and various countries over there do have national Johne's programs. The Netherlands is a prime example where they actually have a national program. They also use milk antibody testing. They in fact use exactly the same testing that we do. But whereas we have a cutoff of 30, they have a cutoff of 100. So they've taken a very different approach to it. The reason we have 30 is because we want to identify animals early in disease and try to prevent them from spreading it onto the next generation. With their cutoff of 100, they're very much looking to just keep lopping the top off. So they want to reduce the heavy shedding animals, because what they're trying to do is to reduce the risk of having any MAP going through into the bulk milk that's collected off farm. So it is something that farmers have to be wary of. So when you're buying animals from the continent and you're being quoted that they are Johne's free, just check the test results and make sure that what we class as being Johne's negative is the same as what you're being quoted from wherever you're buying.
Thank you, Karen. I think for now, we'll just carry on.
Perfect, that's great. Okay, so we've talked a bit about testing, and so now we're going to move on and talk about risks and management. So really important to know what your herd status is. So do you have Johne's on the farm, yes or no? And then if you identify that you do, you need to start looking at levels of Johne's and what you're then going to do to manage it. And the way to think about that is to look at doing a formal risk assessment. So it's about identifying your risks, and there's two forms of risk we need to think about. So the first is the risk of bringing Johne's into your farm. So there is nothing worse than if you are a farm that is in the very lucky position of not having Johne's disease there. The last thing you want to do is to bring it in. So you need to think about your risks of disease entry. And then you also need to think about, okay, so Johne's is already on my farm, or I have a risk of bringing it in. If it gets there, how likely is it to spread on my farm? So it's thinking then about the risks that are within your farm. Now, the problem we have with testing is that if you think about it, we're always looking backwards. So an animal that tests positive today at 4 years of age was very likely infected 4 years ago. So you're kind of always looking backwards because you're saying, okay, she's positive today, but what happened on my farm 4 years ago when she was born? And remember that when you put a plan in place, so hopefully some of you will go home enthused today. Well, home, you're already home, I imagine, but we'll go out today and be enthused and want to manage Johne's. But remember that if you put a management program in place today, the only animals you're protecting are the ones born after today. Everything else that's already there on your farm has had the risk of being Johne's infected. So that's the issue with testing, you're always looking backwards. So what you're trying to do with a risk assessment is start to give you an idea of looking forwards. So you're going to look at what you're doing and say, okay, I'm going to go through the farm in a very structured way with your vet and actually look at all of the areas of risk and say, right, okay, here is my area of risk, what can I do to manage it? And if you can look at them and have effective management in place, then you can be sure that going forward, you're going to reduce the amount of Johne's you have. But again, remember that when you look at that, you're putting that plan in place today, but you may see the number of Johne's positive animals increase over the first few years because they're a legacy from what happened before your plan was put in place. So when you think about a risk assessment, you want it to be formal, you want it to be repeated at least annually. You want to do it with your vet so that you can get the best advice and make sure you're targeting the right things. And that risk assessment will be the basis of your bespoke management plan. And Johne's, there isn't a one size fits all. It's very much about looking at your system, looking at your resources, looking at your aspiration, working with your vet and having a plan in place. So if we break down the risks, the easiest way to look at them is to think about them in terms of whether they're a major risk or a minor risk, whether they're a risk of entry or a risk of spread, and then if they're a risk of spread, whether they are a one-to-many risk. So by that I mean one infectious cow can infect lots of other animals, or they're a one-to-one risk. And by that I mean one cow can infect one calf. And there's different ways of looking at them, and depending on where you are on the journey of Johne's control is dependent on what you're going to tackle off this list. So for Arthur, for example, he's only 18 months into this. So very much he's going to want to concentrate on those major one-to-many risks. So you want to tackle the things that are going to give you the biggest wins. So if you can stop a major one-to-many risk, so you can stop those cows, so that one cow infecting 5 or 10 other calves, then that's a big win. So it's important to concentrate on those and not think about, okay, well, I'm going to try and pick on something that's going to stop that one cow infecting her offspring, because that's a minor risk. Okay, so it's thinking about where you are in the journey and thinking about the things you want to tackle. And that's a really nice way of looking at it to make sure that you don't miss the wood for the trees. It's nothing worse than having a 10-point plan in place. You do 9 of those points, but the one you miss out is the one that's the most risk. Okay, so thinking about this, what we're going to look at first is the risk of entry. It won't surprise any of you to know that when we talk about risk of entry, we're talking about how likely it is for you to bring yonis onto your farm. The easiest way to bring yonis onto your farm is to buy a cow that has yonis. And as I showed you with those pictures before, you won't be able to tell just by looking at her. And a lot of people will be buying heifers, so whether they're in-calf heifers or pre-calving heifers, then actually you can't really test them effectively either. So if you go out and buy 20, 18-month-old heifers, you blood sample them all, they all come back negative, what does that actually mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have yonis, it may just mean that they're in stage 1 of the disease. So easiest way to get yonis onto your farm is to go out, buy a cow, pay good money for her and get the yonis thrown in for free. Other ways that you can bring it on, certainly we need to think about slurry management. So slurry coming from other farms could be a risk. But again, remember, it's about the animals that are exposed to it. So it's thinking about your young stock. They're the most susceptible animals. So thinking about slurry management and your young stock. And watercourses are the other one. So if you have watercourses running through your farm, coming from other farms, again, they could be a risk. So fencing those off from any young stock that are out grazing are a good idea as well. But again, remember, tackle the big things. So you don't want to think about tackling, slurry management, tackling those watercourses, potentially even, tackling some of the other things like rabbits, and then ignoring the fact that you're buying in, excuse me, 20 cows every month. Excuse me. Okay, so that's your risk of entry. So moving on from that, the next thing to think about is risk of spread. And there is a reason for the photograph of a person's finger with a bit of muck on the end of a fingernail. And it's just to highlight that as baby calves with that open gut, these animals are very, very susceptible, and it does not take much infected muck to infect a calf. And if you have animals like those ones I showed you in those results, that cow that was sitting with 2 results over 150 there, she is likely to be shedding billions of bacteria in her muck every day. So a tiny little fingernail's worth of muck can be enough to actually infect that calf. And that's really, really big ask when you think about trying to avoid getting that much muck into the mouth of your calves. So areas we need to think about, the biggest risk area is definitely the maternity area. So these photographs, very kind photographs from Halton Farms, which is another of the strategic dairy farms for AHDB, and are doing excellent job with yonis management. So what they are doing is actually looking at trying to make sure that none of that infected cow muck gets into the mouths of their calves. So there's kind of 2 ways to think about it, really. So I need to prevent that little tiny bit of muck getting into the mouth of my calf in the maternity area. So the first way to think about doing that is, right, I'm going to snatch every calf that's born. So I'm going to get every calf out of my maternity area without it ingesting any muck at all. Now that is a huge ask. It's a very big ask, especially when it's, the middle of the night and you've got cows calving, you've got other things going on. It's a really, really big ask. So actually the other way of looking at it is to say, okay, well, I accept that my calf is going to ingest a bit of muck before it gets out of my maternity area. There's no way around that. So what I need to try and do is make sure that the bit of muck it does ingest doesn't have the MAP bacteria in it. And the best way to do that is to identify your high risk areas. So identify your high risk cows through testing. So you're trying to pick up these animals nice and early in disease. And what you can then do is to make sure that they don't calve in your clean calving area. So you'll see there, you've got a nice picture of the green calving area there. So the only animals that go in there are animals that have never tested yonis positive. As Arthur was saying, you have your red tagged cows, they are your positives. They do not go in that area, and it's very, very easy for everyone to see that. And then you have your red tag calving area, your leper colony, and what goes in there are your animals that you know are yonis positive. Now, that isn't an excuse to put them in a dingy little corner or somewhere that's really not very nice. It's still got to be a nice environment for them to calve in. You've still got to think of their health and welfare and that of the calves, but it's reducing that risk. So what you don't have is a cow that's Johne's positive going in, contaminating all of that bedding in your calving area and potentially allowing any calf that's born in there to be infected. Because remember, it doesn't have to be that calf's mother that has Johne's. If she's gone, she's laying in that bedding, she's got Johne's infected muck on her belly, on her udder, then the first thing that calf does, it gets up, it tries to suckle, it gets a mouthful of map, not from its own mother, but from another animal that's in there. And that's one of those big one-to-many risks. So thinking about what you're going to do around the time of calving is really important. And now we're going to hear a little bit about what Arthur was first doing with his management around the time of calving.
So now we've tested the animals and identified them. The important part now is management at calving. So talk us through how you did this originally 3 years ago.
Originally, when we started this, they were all calving together, and ones with the bed tags, we were snatching the calves off them straight away once they were born, so that they wouldn't suckle the cow. But since then, I didn't see I was gaining much. Every year there was about the same cows, same number of cows with bed tags. So the last year, or last autumn, we split the ones with bed tags to the field on their own. The main herd was calving in this field here, and the ones with the bed tags were calving just the field next door.
There, Arthur's original management techniques. So one question for you, Arthur, you know, in terms of snatch calving, why did you feel this wasn't working for you?
We were snatching the calves from the ones with red tags best we could, really, but there's a lot calving at the same time. It's up to 80 cows in the field, and they calve quite quickly because we've bred them for easy calving, so they don't show much sign of they're ready to calve.
No, that's great. Karen, we've been inundated with lots of questions for you, which is fantastic. One that we've just had in terms of this was, what should I do if I've got a cow that goes Johne's positive during her pregnancy and she's in calf to a black and white?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult one, and it's a common thing that happens, unfortunately. And realistically, you should be looking at not keeping that calf as a replacement. It's got a really high chance of being Johne's positive. If you are utterly desperate to keep it, because, and I've had these conversations many times, it's a high genetic merit cow, it's, you know, to a really expensive straw of semen, it's going to be a, you know, a great animal that comes out. If you're really desperate to keep it, then you can, but I would make sure that you are always aware of the fact that that animal is at a much higher risk of having Johne's than anything else. So my advice would be, if you want to keep that animal, keep it, but make sure you mark it in some way. So whether it's a blue tag in its ear, a red tag in its ear, something like that, so that as that animal comes through your system and comes to first breeding, you know that that animal isn't really one you want to be breeding replacements from, because what you don't want to be doing is perpetuating this disease through your herd. So it is a really difficult one, and also if you have one of those unfortunate animals that goes from being negative to being very high positive, and realistically you should be looking to cull them, that again is obviously very difficult when that animal is pregnant. But most definitely they should be calved separately.
Fantastic. Karen, we've had this question from a few people now, in terms of, is there a risk of young stock to young stock transmission? So will anything in stage 1 be shedding potentially?
Yeah, so again, that's an interesting thing. And with Yonis, every day is a school day, and there's a lot of research being done. And one of the research areas was looking at whether there is calf-to-calf transmission. There was always the assumption that during stage 1 there was no shedding at all. We do know that in very young calves, there is the potential for a calf that has become Yonis infected to shed the bacteria and potentially to infect pen mates. And we think that that's partly because of that incomplete immune system at that time. So again, advice would be if you have calves that are being born out of known Yonis positive animals, then they shouldn't really be going in with your replacement calves. You should be keeping them separate, whether you run them as a group, whether you put them with your beef animals that are going to go for slaughter. But yeah, definitely keeping those away from your replacement animals. So it's not just having that green calving area where you only have your green cows calving in, it's also almost having a green calf area as well. So where you're protecting your replacements from any potentially infected calves.
And another one here is, how long does Yoni survive in muck? So that could be spreading as well, and grazing. How long should you be leaving it between grazing the ground if you spread any slurry?
Yeah, a really horribly long time. Unfortunately, it's quite resistant to heat and UV, and not that we necessarily have that much of either of those in this country, but it's quite resistant to desiccation. So even in very high temperatures, it can last quite a while. It also lasts quite a long time in stagnant water and in muck. And certainly we know that from muck spread on fields, it can last up to 12 months. But again, the important thing to think about is the animals that are likely to then be exposed to it. So if you're thinking about where you're going to spread muck, firstly, think about how you spread muck. So broadcast spreading is going to be worse than injecting, for example, because you're going to end up with more muck on the sward itself. And then think about the animals that are going to go on it. So it's your young animals you're trying to protect. So you wouldn't want to be grazing any animals that are less than 9 months old. Within that year. Your adult cows are significantly less susceptible to it. It takes a much higher dose. So your adult cows you're not going to worry so much about, but you certainly don't want to be putting young stock out there. And for some of the, especially organic guys who are feeding milk still on grass, so putting calves out and still milk feeding them and grazing them, they can have some very young animals out grazing. It's really important that they're on clean pasture.
That's great. And we'll just move on again now. Thanks, Karen.
Perfect. Okay. Right. Okay. So moving on, just continuing the theme of managing risk. Again, just some photographs here. They're more as a bit of a kind of aid memoir to me, really, to make sure I talk about all of these things. So we talked about the importance of trying to segregate out those high-risk cows, so identifying those cows that are likely to be shedding the bacteria in muck, making sure they don't go into your nice green calving area where your replacements are going to be born. You know, you think about one in a straw yard, an infectious animal has the potential to infect that entire yard. And what we know from research is that that is worsened when areas are highly stocked. So you want a nice low stocking density in your calving area, because remember, even with the best testing regime in the world, you may miss the odd positive animal, you may miss the odd shedding animal, so you want to minimize contamination in there. So low stocking, plenty of nice clean straw, plenty of space for these animals, keep them nice and clean. And the other thing to think about is also getting those calves out as quickly as possible. So a couple of examples there, you know, you've got a nice low stocked shed there with lots of nice clean straw, lots of nice, very clean cows. And then you've got another example there of a calving area where you've got very little bedding there. You've got cows with dirty feet, you can see dirty legs, inevitably going to be dirty bellies and udder. You think a calf born into that stands very, very little chance of getting out of there without ingesting the MAP bacteria if one of those cows is a shedder. And remember, it doesn't have to be the mother. Picture there of a bull with a little calf. Again, just a reminder for me. We talked about making sure you ensure the bull is part of your testing regime. It's also important to think about his role in Yonis transmission. So he is just as likely as any of your cows to get Yonis, but you have to think about his potential for spreading it. Now, he's not a risk to your adult cows that he might be serving. There's no evidence that Yonis is spread in semen, But where does he go when he's not working or when he's a bit lame? And if he ends up going into the only bit of straw you've got, which is your dry cow yard, then again, if he's got yonies, he could contaminate that whole yard. So thinking about making sure that your bull doesn't have any opportunity to spread yonies, doesn't have contact with baby calves, and doesn't go into your dry cow area is really important. Another picture at the top there, again, just thinking about practicalities around the time of calving. So, you know, easy things that can be done within these large calving pens just to make it easier to handle those cows and to actually do all of this safely as well. So when we think about the calf, so one of the other things that comes out of research is that getting the calf out of that maternity area as quickly as possible is beneficial. It's not really rocket science. You want to reduce the amount of contact time that animal has with potentially infected muck. So what you want to do is to make sure that you get that animal out as quickly as possible. So what you're going to do is think about actually, okay, how do I do that? Because what we kind of want to do is to make sure that we still give that calf some contact with that cow. So it's beneficial to the cow, it's beneficial to the calf to allow that cow to lick the calf. So from the calf point of view, it stimulates vigor, it can help with them then getting that colostrum down. And from the cow's point of view, it certainly helps her to produce oxytocin, which enables milk letdown and also helps with cleansing. So thinking about ways that you want to do that, because what you don't want to do is to leave that calf in that large maternity area that's potentially contaminated and that could come into contact with lots of cows. So there's a few things to think about here on this slide. So at the bottom there, you'll see a rubber matted calving area. So this particular farm had quite a high yonies incidence, and we're looking at ways to try and help around the time of calving. And it's quite difficult when you've got large maternity areas. So they put this in, and it was a just-in-time calving scenario. They saw a cow coming to calve, brought her in there. Now, the rubber matting makes it very easily cleanable between calvings. If you're looking at something like this, do talk to your vet, do talk to your advisors, because you do need to use the right rubber matting. It needs to be the rubber matting that's quite deep, that allows the cow's hooves to penetrate down into it so that it's not slippery and the cows can stand up and get down easily. But that is quite a nice solution just to make things nice and easily cleanable. You'll see the one at the top there, that is a cow signals cuddle box for any of you who've heard of it. So what happens is the cow calves, she gets brought out there, the calf is put into the green part at the front, so the cow is still able to lick the calf, and then they've also got a portable milking unit there so they can get the colostrum off the cow quickly and get that then into that calf. There are some cheaper options of doing that. You'll see they've got just a large plastic container at the bottom there where you can put the calf. You can also then put some nice warm water in there for the cow. It's really good to get her to drink as soon as possible after calving, and quite often they won't want to leave the calf. So if you can put that right there with the calf, that helps. Just some metal posts around just to form an area that keeps the calf in, allows the cow to get her head through so that again she can still lick that calf. Or an IBC that you can see there. If they were to cut the side panel out of that, that again provides a perfect place to put that calf. It allows cow to calf contact, but it reduces the risk of that calf being contaminated. So it's just some things to think about around the time of calving and how you deal with those newborn calves. So remember, getting colostrum off quickly is important, and getting that colostrum in cleanly is really important as well. Colostrum is a risk in terms of transmission of Johne's disease, but the big thing to think about is actually contamination of that colostrum. So the colostrum itself, even from a Johne's infected animal, is likely to only have very few bacteria in it, but it's the muck that gets in there. So whether that's from contaminated teats that aren't clean, whether it's from a bucket that's in the parlour that doesn't have a lid on, all of those sorts of things. So actually hygiene is incredibly important when we think about milk and colostrum. And remember that whilst milk and colostrum is important, it's muck that's the biggest risk with Johne's. Okay, so now we're going to see the next video from Arthur, and this one's going to be about how his management techniques are changing. So what he's now doing and what he is going to change going forwards.
So you felt that progress wasn't as rapid as you'd hoped for. So just talk us through now the changes that you made during calving this last year.
So last September when they calved, we separated the ones with the red tags and put them in the separate field next door. So they were calving up there on their own, and the main herd was calving here. So they wouldn't mix.
Okay, so and how did this work on a practical basis? Because you've obviously then got two groups rather than one group. So just talk us through how did it work?
It was easier than we expected. A lot easier, really. The main herd was probably, once he checked them, he naturally checked the others as well. And everybody knew then that any calf was born with a gang, with a Jonas gang, to take the calf from there if it was a female calf.
Okay, so the red tags now, do you inseminate them with a beef bull? And
that's the whole point, really, to reduce the risk of carrying the Jonas disease, is to use beef bulls on the red tags.
okay, Arthur, so we're coming up within the last month now of lactation with the ones that we're going to dry off first. So just talk us through if you're intending to make any changes this year compared to last year.
This autumn we're hoping to split the cows again. The red tags will be calving in that field, same as last year, because they worked very well, I think. The only thing we're going to change again is not to pool the milk from the first calvers with the main herd, because these first calvers, they haven't been tested. Even if you get one that's Jonas carrier, you know, that milk will affect a lot of calves. So that's the only difference we're going to make this autumn.
Since we made that video, we just been asked, have you been back through your records yet to identify any offspring from Johne's positive cows? And if you have, how are you going to treat these animals differently to how you treat your other heifers?
Yes, I have actually. Me and the vet went through the records, and we decided that any female calves out of Johne's positive cows, they'll be served with the beef semen. And that really shouldn't make any difference to my replacement rate, because there's a lot more sex semen available these days.
And are you going to calve these in the Johne's positive field?
Yeah, they'll be going with the Johne's cows.
Yeah, and sorry, is there anything else that you're planning to do this year a little bit different to anything that you have done so far?
My in-calf heifers now, if there is the chance of testing some of them, blood testing some of them, we might do that.
Great. Karen, again, we've got lots of questions for you. In terms of transmission from cow to calf, is that possible through the placenta?
Yeah, so there is evidence of in utero transmission. So again, going back to my graph, during stage 2 of infection, where you're getting those ups and downs of antibodies, so no clinical signs, but that animal is definitely battling with the disease. We think the risk is about 1 in 10 of in utero transmission. By the time you get to repeatedly testing very high positive and clinical disease, it's around about 20 to 40% of calves that will actually be infected before they hit the deck. But so that is a real risk. But remember that, again, for those animals that are at the clinical end of disease, even if that calf isn't caught in utero, then it runs a very big risk of being contaminated by that cow's muck and milk.
Okay, and I've just had another question on, is there a vaccination for Johne's? Yes,
there is, but it's not very good. So So yes, there is a vaccine. It's not produced in this country. You have to import it under special license from Spain, and there are some caveats to its use. So again, we're all quite familiar with using, let's take BVD vaccination as an example. So you vaccinate your animals pre-calving to try to protect them during that period they're pregnant, so they don't produce PI animals. That's not quite the same with Johne's. Again, going back to what we talked about before, it's most likely your baby calves that get infected. So your animal's 24 to 48 hours old, and actually we don't vaccinate animals for Johne's until they're at least 7 days old. So the chances are we're vaccinating animals that have already been infected. So all we're trying to achieve really with the Johne's vaccine is not stopping them becoming infected, but helping the animal keep a lid on the disease for a bit longer. So what we do is try to, let's say you would have an animal going clinical at 3 years of age. If it's a vaccinated animal, it might be able to keep a lid on the disease for another year. So you might get another year of productive life out of it. So it tends to be an option of last resort for farms, because it's not a way of getting rid of the disease. It is literally just keeping a lid on it. And the other problem we have is once you vaccinate an animal for Johne's, then it has Johne's antibodies. So it becomes even more complicated then to determine which animals are actually infected rather than just vaccinated. So it can be quite difficult once you enter a vaccine strategy to work your way back out of it as well. So it's not something to enter into lightly, and you know, it is something that is probably one of those options of last resort.
Cool. And just one more that we've had a couple of times now. Is it possible for adult cows to become infected with Johne's after the calf stage?
It is, yeah. So there is no stage of life where cows are completely resistant to becoming infected with Johne's, but you saw that picture before where it was that tiny little bit of muck on the fingernail. So that's potentially how much it takes to infect a baby calf. But as the animal gets older, the number of bacteria it takes to infect that animal grows. So by the time they become adults, they need a huge quantity of bacteria to actually become infected. And also the thing to remember is, let's say an animal becomes infected at 3 years of age, she still then has that incubation period. So the chances of her actually showing any signs of disease before she's called out of your herd are significantly less. So when we start looking at tackling Johne's, although we accept that adult to adult transmission is possible, it is not one of the big risk areas that we concentrate on. It might be something that you need to think about if you're getting towards the, you know, the real kind of nub of Johne's control and down to very low levels, but it certainly isn't somewhere to concentrate your efforts to begin with.
Great. If we just carry on, Karen, and then the rest of the questions that we've got coming in, we'll ask at the end of your presentation. Perfect.
Nearly finished, I promise. Okay, so moving on, again, just a couple of more pictures here. So Arthur's scenario, he is an autumn block carver, so he's going to be carving those animals outdoors. Now that brings some benefits in that it's usually a larger space in which those animals are, so stocking density is less, so often the actual environmental contamination with MAP is less. But it's important to think about the environment they're in, and when inevitably we get lots of rain and you get muddy gateways, muddy tracks, mud around water troughs, etc., that's then mixed with cow muck, you end up with cows with those socks of mud and muck. And think about cows when they lie down, where do those feet go? They go right up under her belly, and one inevitably sits with her udder on top of it. So thinking again about the cleanliness of those animals that are outside, because if they're getting lots of mud, if they're getting dirty bellies, dirty udders, then again you run the risk of those calves that are being born, if they're given the opportunity to stand and try to suckle, again the first thing they get instead of a mouthful of colostrum can be a mouthful of MAP. So cleanliness of those animals, cleanliness of the areas they're in is equally as important if you're carving outdoors or indoors. Okay, so last one. So what I want to do is to just wrap up now and think about, you know, what are the benefits of actually doing all of this? So what is the benefit of testing? Why would you bother doing it? And what's the benefit of having those strategic management things in place, and also having a good culling policy of getting rid of your Johne's infected cows. So the first thing to think about is that what it does do is reduce the probability of clinical disease developing. So for some people, and Arthur was an example there, he said, you know, oh, we had the odd clinical case, you know, 1 or 2 a year maybe. And generally, by the time those animals get to that clinical disease, you're not going to get anything back for them. Even if you are able to cull them before they have to be shot on farm or go as a dead loss, you're unlikely to get much cull value for them because they've lost a lot of weight. So, you know, you really don't get much money. By being able to identify those animals earlier in the disease, so in stage 2 rather than stage 3, yes, it helps you in terms of being able to block transmission. That's a really huge one, but also it reduces the probability of those animals becoming clinical. So what you're able to do is to cull them out of your herd whilst you can still get some money for them. So actually in some situations we do see that by being able to actually target those culls better, you can actually recoup some of the money back that you're going to have to lay out for testing and management. So economic benefits, that higher cull salvage value, definitely there. So no more clinical cases, you're going to get higher cull salvage value. And also it just means that you're going to have much more of a control over the animals that are leaving your herd. Definitely improved welfare. So we don't want to see clinical cases of Johne's. If anybody's ever seen one, they are not a nice thing to see at all. It is a serious welfare issue. Even during the stage 2, we have welfare issues there because they are less able to deal with the other things that might be thrown at them. So they are more likely to be high cell count, they are more likely to have clinical mastitis, lameness, etc. So by reducing Johne's and getting rid of these positive animals, you do have a positive welfare impact on farm as well. By getting rid of those high-risk animals, so those animals that are shedding MAP, you just reduce the general amount of MAP in the environment. And we've just had the question about adult-to-adult transmission. And if you think about it, if you are keeping lots of heavy shedding animals, and they're all there in your adult herd, in your cubicle shed, in your straw yards, in your paddocks, they are just kicking out lots and lots of MAP and contaminating your environment. And if you have lots of them, the more MAP you have in your environment, the higher your risk of adult-to-adult transmission. Also, the higher risk then of if you have an issue with slurry management, for example. So something happens with your slurry management and a load of adult cow slurry ends up in your calf shed, ends up in your young stock. Then again, if you've actually got rid of a lot of those high shedders, then yes, you might have that mishap with slurry, but that slurry isn't as bad. So what you're trying to do, you're trying to identify your high-risk animals and create that green calving line. So you want that safe area that your replacement heifers are going to be born in. So that area where no known Johne's positive animals go, it's clean, it's well bedded, it's not highly stocked, and you're getting those calves out there quickly. And they come out of that green calving line and they go into your green calf line. So again, you're protecting them. There's no calves in there that have come out of known Johne's positive animals. You're being really careful when you're thinking about what milk and colostrum you're feeding them. So you're never going to feed them colostrum or milk from a Johne's positive animal. You're absolutely going to be clean when you're harvesting milk and colostrum. So think about creating those low risk environments for them. And again, by getting rid of, so actually culling out some of these high risk animals, you have less risk of test positive animals being born. And I know it can be quite difficult, and again, conversations I have about culling and how to go about it, and the question about, oh well, you know, that animal's pregnant, I don't want to get rid of her. Well, the best way to cull out positive animals is to not breed them in the first place. So if you have positive animals that are coming up to the point of being bred, if you don't breed them, then they are automatically going to leave your herd at the end of lactation. If you breed them, then you give yourself a really difficult decision should the wheels fall off partway through pregnancy. So actually take it back from making culling decisions to making breeding decisions and make your life a little bit easier. And by doing all of these things, you absolutely improve your probability of control in the longer term. And bear in mind that Johne's control is long term. This isn't something you're going to get over in a year or two. And actually, for the first 2 to 3 years, you're unlikely to see the fruits of your labour at all. Because remember that the calf that you're protecting that's born today, it's going to be another 2 years before she enters your adult herd and you start to see the benefits of having fewer test positives. So do make sure you keep the faith when you start this. Don't get 2 or 3 years in and get disheartened because things look worse. Remember that you're always looking backwards with your testing. So identify your high risk animals, make sure you've got that strategic management, especially around the time of calving, and think about the animals that you need to cull out. And then you are going to have a much higher probability of controlling this disease. Okay, so thanks, Rachel. Over to you for any more questions.
Thank you, Karen. We have had so many questions, so thank you everybody for all of the questions that you've sent in. Unfortunately, we're not going to get time to answer them all right now. We will send answers in follow-up emails to you, so please don't be disheartened if we don't get round to you. I have got one question, Arthur, for you, in terms of, do you pasteurise your colostrum at all?
No, we haven't never pasteurised it. We just there's fresh colostrum every day really, and we try and cover the bucket once it's been in the parlour to stop any muck going on it.
Great. And Karen, in terms of that, from your opinion, pasteurising colostrum, how effective?
Yeah, so a couple of things to think about here really. So I've seen it happen where people have bought a pasteuriser and think that that's going to solve their Johne's problem. Don't get me wrong, it's going to help, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not a one-off fix all. You've got to think about your biggest risk areas. So there's no point in having, you know, beautiful pasteurized colostrum if your calf has just come out having spent 24 hours in a dirty yard where it's surrounded by cows with Johne's. So thinking about it as part of a management solution. Yes, pasteurizing colostrum is good. It actually has been demonstrated to have some benefits in terms of passive transfer. So the research shows that pasteurized colostrum, actually calves have better immunoglobulin levels with pasteurized versus raw colostrum. They think it's probably to do with removing some of the bacteria out of the colostrum that would compete for sites to cross the gut, so it lets more antibodies cross. So it's good in terms of general calf health as well. But the thing to think about as well is it's not 100% effective. It gives you a log reduction in bacteria. So you've got to be clean in what you're putting in to start with. You can't just be putting, you know, a pile of muck in and expecting it to be good at the end. It is a numbers game, so thinking about that. But yeah, absolutely, it can be part of a good Johne's management strategy.
Fantastic, thank you, Karen. Right, I'm really sorry, everyone, but there really isn't any more time for any more questions right now. So, Karen, if you don't mind just going on to the next slide for me.
Yeah, of course.
So the webinar today has been run in conjunction with Farming Connect, and we've just been given a couple of slides to explain a little bit more what they do in supporting farmers and foresters, specifically in Wales. So on this slide, there's a couple of examples of services that they can offer specifically to dairy farmers. So there's one-to-one surgeries that can be accessed where farmers can receive 1 hour's free advice covering a range of topics using solicitors, accountants, consultants and other industry professionals. There's also a full range of webinars available on their website at the moment, and you can see a couple of them on this slide. Also on their website, you'll be able to find podcasts, articles, project updates and much more. So on the next slide, we're just explaining here that there's 3 dairy technical officers across Wales. These are Rhys, Simon, Gwennon, and these technical officers run farm projects with the Farming Connect demonstration farms and focus farms. They then disseminate this information back out to farmers across Wales, and they're also running events and issue technical information to all of their farmers. You're more than welcome to contact any of them for support at any time. And if you don't manage to get their contact details from this, it will come out to you in an email later on so you can contact them. So there's just one final thing to highlight from the Welsh Assembly, that there's the new Welsh Dairy Support Scheme, which was announced on the 3rd of June, and you should have received some information about that. So our final slide from me is just to sum up to say thank you again today for taking part. You will receive a follow-up email and you'll have the opportunity to give us feedback after this webinar. So please do that. It helps us to improve for the future. Keep a lookout, as Nick said, on our social media platforms and also on upcoming webinars that we've got. Anybody that is a Dairy Pro member, if you could just type your name, your farm name and your membership number into the questions box, we can make sure you get these points. If you don't know your membership number, please could you send in your farm name, your name and your postcode, and we should be able to find you from that. Once again, a massive thank you to Karen for all of the information she's given us today, and also to Arthur for his time and the videos that were done beforehand. So we're going to sign off now, and again, thank you for taking part, and we hope you found it useful and informative.